Welcome back to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're here today because we are going to completely deconstruct one of the most famous, most repeated stories in human history. We're talking about the popular nativity scene. We're going to strip away all those centuries of accumulated tradition and folklore to get down to the raw, historical, and deeply theological reality actually found in the biblical text of Matthew chapter 2. As you'll see, God's massive promise plan doesn't unfold through pristine, peaceful fables. It unfolds through intense world historical conflict, deeply rooted Old Testament prophecies, and the arrival of some incredibly unexpected guests.
Okay, let's dive into this, because I bet the nativity set sitting on your mantle right now gets a few crucial things wrong. We are so used to this cozy image of three kings in royal robes showing up at a stable on the actual night of Jesus' birth. But is that what really happened? If we look closely at the historical mystery embedded in the text, we're going to find that the true story is so much more complex, politically dangerous, and honestly, infinitely more fascinating than the romanticized folklore we've all been taught. All right, Section 1, the nativity myth versus the true Magi.
Let's kick off our first major textual investigation by asking a really simple question. Who exactly were these guys arriving in Jerusalem? To understand the sheer magnitude of this event, we have to establish their true identity. The Greek word used in the text is Magoi. First off, these men were definitely not kings. They were most likely Persian or Babylonian astrologers and sky watchers. You see, in the ancient Near East, these guys combined astronomical observation with the interpretation of cosmic portents. They genuinely believed that extraordinary celestial events marked the birth of divine rulers. And what's just absolutely incredible here is that God doesn't just dismiss their occupation. Instead, he literally utilizes their specific pagan cultural practice of sky watching to draw them to the true king. Think about it. These are the very first explicit Gentile characters introduced in the gospel narrative, and they are navigating their way to Jesus by the stars. So they roll into Jerusalem and ask this seemingly innocent question: where is he who has been born King of the Jews? Now, in the historical context of the first century, you have to understand this wasn't just some polite, passing inquiry. This question, coming from foreign Gentiles, introduced a massive, explosive political threat right into the heart of the region. Which brings us right to Section 2, Paranoia in the Holy City. Now, what's really interesting is the tense political and religious climate inside Jerusalem the exact moment the Magi arrive. Just look at the profound moral contrast happening here. On one side, you have the pagan Magi. They've traveled an enormous distance from the east, acting in pure, unadulterated faith based on a sign in the sky. On the other side, you have the religious elite of Jerusalem, the chief priests and the scribes. When they're asked where the Messiah is supposed to be born, they instantly know the answer. They correctly cite the prophecy of Micah 5:2 pointing straight to Bethlehem. But here's the kicker. They possess all the structural, textual knowledge of God's promise, but they show absolute apathy. They literally refuse to walk the short 5-mile distance from Jerusalem to Bethlehem to even investigate the Messiah's arrival for themselves. And then there's King Herod. The text points out that when Herod heard the Magi's question, he was troubled and all Jerusalem with him. Now, why was everyone so freaked out? Well, Herod the Great was an Idumean client king, basically an outsider appointed by the Roman Senate. He had absolutely zero legitimate Davidic lineage. And worse, he was a tyrant. He was literally legendary for his ruthless, violent paranoia regarding anyone he saw as a potential rival to his throne. The whole city of Jerusalem was terrified because they knew exactly how Herod reacted when he felt threatened. To Herod, a newborn king of the Jews wasn't a savior. He was a direct, dangerous political rival. Moving on to Section 3, the house, not the stable. So the story moves along the physical journey. The guiding star totally bypasses all the political, deceptive intrigue of Jerusalem and leads the Magi straight to the child. But notice this. When the Magi finally arrive, the text uses the Greek word oikia, which translates directly to house. They didn't pull up to a stable on the night of the birth. This reveals a completely normal Middle Eastern domestic setting. It means the family had already settled into standard village accommodations well after the initial chaos of the Nativity. So this completely rewrites the timeline of those traditional nativity scenes we're so used to seeing. The Magi actually showed up much later, when Jesus was already living in a house. Once they enter the house, the Magi fall down and worship the child, and they present their famous gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Now, these aren't just random expensive baby gifts. They carry deep Old Testament antecedents. Passages like Psalm 72 and Isaiah 60 specifically speak of foreign nations bringing royal tribute to the light of Israel. The Magi's worship is the visible, breaking into history fulfillment of the ancient Abrahamic promise that in Abraham's seed all the families of the earth would be blessed. It's just this stunning picture of Gentiles bowing down to the true king.
And finally, Section 4, Tyrants, Prophets, and Exiles.
After presenting their gifts, the Magi are warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, so they slip away in secret. And this initiates a very dark and dramatic turn in the narrative. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how the Gospel of Matthew uses promise plan theology. Matthew is intentionally showing us that Jesus is reliving and fulfilling Israel's entire corporate history. Look at the parallels here. An angel warns Joseph to flee to Egypt to escape Herod. Egypt was a standard Roman province outside Herod's jurisdiction, so practically it made a great refuge. But theologically, it perfectly fulfills Hosea 11:1, "Out of Egypt I called my son." Jesus is being presented as the ultimate ideal son of God who succeeds right where national Israel failed. Herod takes on the role of the murderous Pharaoh from Exodus 1, and Jesus is cast as the new Moses, miraculously preserved from an imperial massacre so he can deliver his people.
When Herod realizes he's been outwitted by the Magi, he flies into a completely violent rage and orders the execution of all male children 2 years old and under in Bethlehem. Now, because Bethlehem was a tiny village, the actual number of slain infants was likely under 20. But make no mistake, the moral atrocity of this act is immense and horrific. Matthew frames this tragedy using Jeremiah 31:15. That haunting image of Rachel weeping for her children. Historically, Ramah was a staging area for Judahite captives being marched off into the Babylonian exile. By invoking this specific verse, Matthew is validating the horrific, visceral grief of these mothers. But he's also signaling something profound. Because that prophecy in Jeremiah is surrounded by promises of the new covenant, this absolutely tragic moment marks the ultimate end of Israel's spiritual exile.
Let's trace this entire geographical journey. First, Joseph displays this incredible patriarchal obedience that perfectly mirrors his Old Testament namesake, who also found refuge in Egypt. Joseph obeys the dream and flees. Then, in 4 BCE, the tyrant Herod the Great dies. Joseph gets recalled to Israel by an angel, but when he learns that Herod's brutal son, Archelaus, is now ruling Judea, he's warned to withdraw north, up to the region of Galilee. So he ends up settling his family in a small, obscure, backwater village called Nazareth. Matthew wraps up this chapter by stating that all of this fulfilled what the prophet said, he shall be called a Nazarene. Now, if you look for that specific verse in the Old Testament, you won't find it, because it's actually a brilliant prophetic synthesis. First, there's a really clever Hebrew wordplay going on. The root word for Nazareth is likely connected to Netzer, which means branch, directly evoking Isaiah 11:1. Jesus is the hidden messianic branch growing right out of the stump of David's line. Second, it perfectly synthesizes the Old Testament motif of lowly origins. Nazareth was despised. It was insignificant. The prophets, like in Psalm 22 and Isaiah 53, repeatedly declared that the Messiah would be humble and overlooked. So settling in a seemingly insignificant village perfectly wrapped up the prophetic identity of a hidden, lowly king. So, what does this all mean for us? We see that the true identity of the Magi and the raw historical realities of Matthew chapter 2 completely shatter that safe, quiet, sanitized nativity myth we're so used to. God's redemptive plan breaks into history right in the middle of intense conflict, and yet human tyranny and political paranoia are completely, utterly powerless to stop it. And because of that, the revelation of the king demands a reaction. The big question this text leaves us with is this: in the clash between human tyranny and unstoppable divine promise, what is your response to the arrival of the true king? Are you going to react with the murderous self-preservation of Herod, the scholarly apathy of the religious elite, or the humble, joyful, and costly worship of the true Magi? Definitely something to think on. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see you next time.